Wyoming Territory, late summer 1880. He saw her before the sun cleared the spine of the pines, light hair caught on the roof beam, boots turning slow in the breeze that came down off the ridge. The cabin's door beneath her was blackened, one word seared into the plank in jagged letters, the edges still splintered from heat. He did not call out. He stepped closer. The frost that gathered overnight on the grass crunched under his boots. Her shape was rigid against the paling sky, too still for comfort, too slow to be wind. Jonah Boone knew rope burn when he saw it. He had tied enough knots in another life, for other reasons. His hands went to work without asking his head. The hemp bit deep into her throat, but not past the point of return. He slid an arm around her waist and lifted until the line went slack, then worked it free with fingers that had once known musket grips and reins. She sagged into him, light in a way that made him think of winter birds, all bone and hollow heat. Her breath touched his collar, a dry, shallow rasp. She was not gone, not yet. He shifted her weight across his shoulder. The lean of her ribs against his back was unsteady, the rhythm broken. The ground here was treacherous with loose stone, but he moved like a man who knew the slope by memory. Somewhere behind him, down toward the flats, a rifle cracked. The sound was thin but sharp enough to raise the hair on his neck. A second shot answered the first, spaced like a signal. Jonah did not quicken for the noise alone. He quickened because noise meant company, and company up here was never friendly. He cut away from the cabin, following the narrow game trail that wound toward the creek. The air held the aftersmell of charred pine, as if the word on the door had burned straight into the trees. The girl's head lolled forward, the pale of her cheek marked with grime and blood gone brown. Somewhere in the fog of his mind, a verse he hadn't thought of in years came uninvited. The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. It was gone as quickly as it came, like breath on glass, but it left a trace. He reached the lean-to he'd pieced together months ago under a canopy of spruce, the sort of place a man could vanish into if he needed to. Lifting her down, he set her on a bed of deer hide and patched wool. Her lips moved, but no sound came. The eyes stayed closed. Jonah crossed to the stream that ran a dozen steps behind the shelter, broke the surface with a tin cup, and returned with water still cold from the mountain. He dampened a cloth, wiped the soot from her mouth and the bruise shadowing her jaw. Her breathing steadied by inches. The quiet around them was thick enough to feel, yet his ears strained against it, waiting for the wrong sound, a branch snapping where it shouldn't, metal against leather. He glanced at her again. Whoever had done this hadn't meant to kill quick. The hanging had been a message. He'd seen that kind of cruelty before, on other borders, in other years. The sort that carried a second wave behind it. Men coming to finish what they'd started. Jonah stepped outside the lean-to and scanned the tree line. Shadows shifted with the wind, nothing more. But he read the earth anyway. Fresh boot marks in the soft dirt, sharp-heeled and careless, not his. He banked the small fire until it was little more than coals and laid a flat stone across the top. Smoke was a signal he didn't care to send. When he came back in, she was still where he'd left her, but her fingers twitched against the hide. He pulled a blanket over her shoulders and knelt beside the bedroll. "This time," he murmured to no one but himself, "I won't let the fire decide." Her breath was thin but present, the faint flutter of it brushing against the back of his hand as he checked again. Jonah had carried wounded before, on battlefields where the air stank of powder, and in mining camps where rockfall had left men groaning in the dust. This was different. Those had been soldiers and laborers, their fates bound to the work they'd chosen. This woman's wounds were the work of hate. A low wind pressed through the spruces, bending them enough to creak. He listened for the rhythm beneath it, the offbeat step of someone moving slow to stay quiet. But only the trees answered. He dampened the cloth again, holding it to her temple, where a bruise spread like stormlight under her skin. A rope burn circled her neck in a dark, raw line. That mark had been meant for the whole world to see. Her lips parted, and this time a sound escaped. It wasn't a word so much as a name, mumbled in the half-language of someone lost between sleep and waking. Buru Hambor. Jonah didn't know the tum, but he knew the weight in it. Some names you could feel, even when you didn't understand. He set the cloth aside, her eyes snapped open, wild, not seeing him, her body jolted, arms flailing against the blanket. She clawed at her neck, gasping, voice breaking on half-formed pleas. "Easy," Jonah said, catching her wrists, not to hurt, only to stop her from tearing at herself. "You're not there anymore." She didn't hear him, not really. Her gaze darted like she was tracking ghosts. She twisted free of one hand, made for the lean-to's small hearth where a kindling knife lay. Jonah moved faster. He caught her around the waist, drawing her back. Her weight fought his grip for a breath, then buckled, knees folding under her. "Not like this," he said quietly, holding her upright until the fight drained away. Her breathing slowed, but only just. He eased her down onto the deer hide, kept one hand near in case the panic came again. After a moment, she turned her face away from him and spoke in a voice hoarse with dust and something older. "Who are you?" "Jonah Boone," he said. "This is my place." "You found me?" He nodded. Her shoulders curved inward, arms folding tight against herself. It was the posture of someone who had learned to take up less space than they were owed. After a long silence, she said, "My name is Evelyn Crowley." The surname landed like a thrown stone in still water. He hadn't heard it in years, but the ripples it sent through him were old and deep. "My father was Judge Nathaniel Crowley," she went on, unaware of his stillness. "I left years ago after he struck me for the last time." Jonah didn't answer. "I didn't just leave," she said. "I followed someone. He found me bleeding in the creek behind our land. Said I wasn't the enemy. Said no one's born one." "You loved him," Jonah said. She nodded once. "We lived in the canyons. I learned his words, wore his mother's beads, slept under the stars. They came for us last winter. Men my father paid, men I knew from town. They killed him, took me." Her sleeve slid back as she shifted. The bruises had faded, but the burns still spoke in the skin's memory. "They called me a witch, said I'd shamed my blood. Dragged me from town to town, left me hanging to keep other girls from loving like I did." Jonah's jaw worked, silent. He could smell the smoke again, not from this morning, but from years past, when fire had chewed through a village he'd been ordered to leave untouched. He'd gone back after, looking for survivors, and found his wife by the riverbank, his daughter beside her. He had buried them both himself. And when the last stone was in place, he had broken his rifle's trigger and sworn never to take a side again. He looked at the woman before him, scarred, half-starved, and still breathing, and felt the shape of that vow shift. Outside, the wind rattled the high branches like bones. Somewhere far below, in the flats, a dog barked and was answered by another. Jonah pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Rest now," he said. But in his chest, another voice, quieter, insisted there would be no rest, not for her and not for him, until something long buried was faced. "If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating." He chose the deeper timber, not the easy stand by the creek, but the darker run of spruce upslope, where the ground went soft and needle-thick, and a man could vanish by taking 2 steps sideways. The sun had only just climbed the ridge, sliding gold through branches. Jonah marked a rectangle with boot scuffs, laid his palm to the bark, and listened to the tree's quiet. He wasn't asking permission so much as promising not to bruise more than he had to. He worked without hurry and without waste. 2 saplings for the ridge beam, notched shallow so they'd seat one another like folded hands. Cross sticks cut from deadfall, never green wood. He looped cord through the holes he'd bored years back, when this spot was only a notion he carried to keep himself from talking to ghosts. The lean of the frame took shape in the way a song returns, familiar before the words come. He set each joint until it stopped arguing. The ground was duff and roots and old rock. He scraped it flat with a shovel whose handle had been wrapped and rewrapped with rawhide, smoothed a sleeping shelf, then hauled armfuls of spruce tips to put under the hides. The resin bled sharp and clean. When he spread the blankets, he set the better wool to the windward side and left the rougher one where the foot of the bed would ride. Small courtesies mattered, especially the kind unspoken. By mid-morning he'd found a doorway. Not a gate, he didn't care for that word, but a canvas flap stitched from old flour sacks and a strip of oiled leather to weight the bottom. He pegged the corners with stakes he whittled smooth so they wouldn't snag a dress. From his bundle he took a small tin of bear grease and, with his thumb, worked it along the seam where rain liked to collect. The smell of it tugged up old winters and sod huts, hard seasons survived by being patient rather than brave. He left room inside for a woman's reaching, a crate pushed against the wall for folded things, a niche cut into the earth bank for a cup and a comb and a string of beads if she had any left. He tamped the shelf with the heel of his hand, testing it twice. On the far side he dug a shallow pit for a cook fire no higher than a hat brim and stacked a circle of stones around it, one of them flat enough to warm bread. He didn't know what bread she liked. He only knew warmth had a way of speaking when the mouth failed. From the trail below, a horse blew through its nose. Jonah stepped to the edge of the timber and waited. Whit Carter rode into view on a paint with a hock that clicked. The sound Whit always swore was just the saddle talking. The old man didn't come all the way in. He lifted a coiled length of tarred rope and a canvas roll of tools, gimlet, auger, a square, a mallet with a new rawhide face. "Found these lying around a life I don't use much," Whit said, voice sanded down by years. Jonah nodded once and took them. No more words were needed. Evelyn walked up later, slow and careful, a hand on the saplings as if testing the world's willingness to hold her. She stood in the doorway a long beat, watching the light slant through the weave of the canvas and turning her face as if to learn the temperature of shelter. He stayed back under the trees and named what needed naming. Where the stream lay, where the path curled out in case of trouble, where the bearberry grew thick if sleep wouldn't come and she wanted something to do with her hands. She said nothing, which seemed right. When she did sit at last, she didn't collapse so much as fold, the way a bird tucks itself against weather. Her eyes rimmed wet and didn't hide it. He looked away in the manner of a man giving a room to someone he cared to see stand again. He set a small clay bowl by the doorway with a bit of salt and a sprig of thyme he'd found near the rocks. Salt for keepin', thyme for mendin'. Old mountain talk, maybe, or only an excuse to leave something behind that wasn't made o' wood and work. He stayed long enough to make sure the canvas pulled true and the ridge held, then eased the mallet down on the stump like it was a livin' thing that needed quiet. He didn't bless the place aloud. He didn't have that kind of language anymore. But the shape of it did what words used to do for him. It told a future it could carry. He lifted his hat to her, more habit than ceremony, then stepped back into the spruce. He let the hammer fall silent and left the space hers, a promise nailed without words. Dustwater was a half-day's ride if you cut straight through the meadow breaks, but news had a way of running faster than horses. It came up the ridge in the mouth of a trader, in the clink of tin cups at Whit Carter's porch, in the whisper that carried farther than the wind. There was money on the head of the Crowley girl. Money and cattle, paid clean to the man who brought her in, breathin' just enough to hang. Whit hadn't said it to Jonah straight, but he'd let the words drift while untangling the rope Jonah had returned from yesterday's work. "Saw a rider from down south," Whit had muttered, eyes on the knot. "Said there's a purse waitin' Friday, big enough to make men forget the Sabbath." Friday. The word stuck like a burr in the coat lining. 4 days wasn't long, not with the kind of men who'd ride for coin and cause. Jonah didn't repeat it to Evelyn, not yet. She'd been out at the new shelter that morning, folding the canvas flap back to air the wool and brushing spruce needles off the sleeping shelf. She carried herself different now, not loose exactly, but less braced for a blow. He let her have that. On the trail east of the lean-to, a set of prints crossed the damp earth where the moss still held night water. Small boots, heel-worn, and beside them the sharper wedge of bare toes. Not Evelyn's. Jonah crouched, touching the edge of the print. Whoever it was had paused here, just far enough to see the shelter through the timber. Watching, not wandering. When he came back that afternoon, there was a sign waiting, 3 flat stones laid on a stump in the shape of an arrow, the point angled downslope toward the creek. No boot prints this time, just the trace of a handprint where the loam had been brushed smooth. Jonah followed the arrow far enough to find the other sign, a cluster of horse tracks cut deep in the clay near the water, shod on the front hooves, barefoot on the back, a string rider's trick for keeping pace quiet. 4 horses, maybe 5. He walked the bank until he found where one had stepped into the shallows, the scuff of iron on river rock. Red paint still clung to the shoe in thin veins, worn but visible. It wasn't a ranch brand, it was parade paint, the kind some men left on long after the fair, like a badge of belonging. Jonah had seen it before, on cavalry remounts turned loose to the highest bidder. Back at the shelter, Evelyn was tending a pot over the shallow fire pit, the smell of boiled roots and sage leaf drifting in the cooling air. She looked up when he came in. "You went far," she said. "Not so far," he answered. "Close enough to see the trail." She studied him for a moment, then stirred the pot again without speaking. She was learning his silences, the ones that meant there was something outside the canvas walls she didn't need to face yet. Before dusk, he walked the perimeter again. The arrow of stones was gone. In its place, a single feather leaned against the sapling by the creek crossing. Black-tipped, white-shafted, crow feather, bound at the base with a strip of red cloth. It was a mark he hadn't seen in years, but he remembered the boy who used it. Tommy Greyhawk. Half Apache, half Irish, and all edges. Tommy had been a shadow in every town that didn't want to claim him. Jonah had helped him once, long before either of them had reason to hide. The feather was his way of saying, "I'm close, and so are they." Jonah tucked the feather into the pocket of his coat and felt the weight of Friday tighten another notch. 4 days to prepare, and every one of them would be shorter than the last. That night, as the sky pulled down the last light, he heard the distant ring of a bridle bell. 1 note, then silence. Evelyn lifted her head in the half-dark. "What was that?" "Wind," he said, though they both knew wind didn't keep rhythm. Friday had a way of riding toward them whether they moved or not. Jonah started at first light, the cold still hanging under the pines, the air sharp enough to bite. The shelter and lean-to had good cover from a distance, but if anyone got within 50 yards, there was nothing to slow them. He intended to change that. He cut strips of old tin from a discarded bucket, hammering them flat against a stump until they bent easy. A half-dozen of them went on rawhide lines stretched between saplings, ankle height, quiet until they hit tension. He tied broken glass into the tins so they'd rattle loud enough to wake him if a boot caught them. Farther out, along the ridge trail, he rigged trip branches from green willow and pine, the kind that would slap hard into a horse's legs and send a rider cursing into the dirt. They wouldn't kill a man, that was the point. Jonah hadn't taken a life in years, and he wasn't about to break that vow unless the woods left him no choice. Evelyn came up from the stream carrying a pail of water, her hair damp at the ends where she'd washed it in the cold. She stopped beside him, watching as he knotted one of the tin lines. "You've done this before," she said. "Long ago," Jonah replied without looking up. "It's not about stopping them, it's about knowing when they're here." She studied the length of rawhide, the sharp edge of the tin glinting in the low sun. "And when you know?" He tied the last knot, pulled the line taut, and let it hum in the air. "Then we decide." By noon, the traps were set in a half-moon arc, the ridge on one side, the creek on the other. He left the west edge open. The forest was thicker there, and the ground too rocky for hooves. That would be their escape line if it came to it. The work done, Jonah walked the east trail toward the old military road, where the ridge broke wide enough for a man to see 50 miles on a clear day. It was there, halfway down the slope, that he saw the rider. The figure was dark against the pale dust of the road, coat long, hat low, a Bible clutched in one hand like it was weightless. Reverend Elias Harper didn't ride fast, he never had, but the way he sat a saddle, tall and steady, was the same as it had been 20 years ago. Jonah raised a hand. Elias slowed, reining in until his horse stood at the edge of the slope. "Jonah Boone," the Reverend said, voice carrying like a low bell. "Didn't reckon I'd see you above the timberline again." "Didn't reckon I'd be here," Jonah answered. Elias studied him for a long moment, eyes narrowing just slightly. "She's the one, isn't she? The girl they're talking about?" Jonah didn't move. "You hear a lot for a man riding alone." "I hear enough to pray specific," Elias said. He shifted in the saddle, the creak of leather breaking the quiet. Psalm 34:18. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Keep that close, Jonah. There's more than bullets in the days ahead. With that, the Reverend touched the brim of his hat and rode on, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the valley below. Jonah stood there a while after he was gone, the wind sliding up from the basin, carrying the scent of sage and something heavier, smoke maybe, or the promise of it. By the time he got back to the shelter, the light was thinning. Evelyn was sitting cross-legged by the fire pit, the feather from Tommy's warning lying across her knees. She didn't look up when Jonah approached. "They're coming," she said quietly. He didn't answer. Some things didn't need words, only preparation. And the woods were already holding their breath. The wind shifted after dark. Jonah felt it before he heard anything, a faint, cool draft that cut across the campfire smoke and carried a scent not born of pine or creek. Oil. He rose without a word, motioning Evelyn toward the lean-to's shadow. His hand brushed the nearest rawhide tripline, checking tension. Still tight, still unbroken. That meant they were close, but not yet in the clearing. Minutes crawled. Then came the first sound, a metallic clink to the north, tin rattling softly. Jonah's jaw tightened. The second alarm tripped almost immediately after, to the east. Whoever they were moving in from two sides. 3 men emerged from the dark, like predators that had learned to walk upright. One limped, his step dragging through the needles. Another had a knife as long as a man's forearm, its edge catching stray firelight. The third, broad-shouldered, grinning, carried a coiled rope in one hand and a half-empty kerosene bottle in the other. They thought they had the numbers. They didn't know the ground. The limp-footed one came first, stepping over the low fire pit. Jonah moved behind him like smoke, hooked an arm across his neck, and drove an elbow into his ribs, just enough to take his breath and send him down without a sound. The knife man was quicker. He spun, slashing at the dark, but Jonah's shoulder hit him low, driving him back against a trunk. The blade clattered into the dirt. One hard fist to the jaw, and he went limp, sliding down the bark. The rope man was faster than either, and meaner. He saw the others drop and didn't hesitate, yanked a revolver from his belt and fired. The shot tore through the branches above Jonah's head, splintering wood. Evelyn heard it from the shelter, her breath caught, her mind racing. If the rope man pushed forward, Jonah wouldn't be enough to stop him. She grabbed the oil lantern from its hook, yanked the flint from Jonah's kit, and bolted into the tree line. Her hand shook as she struck steel to stone, sparks flaring against the wind. She tipped the lantern, spilling oil into the brush. One more strike, and the dry summer grass ignited with a sound like paper tearing. The fire caught fast, leaping from weed to pine branch, throwing shadows that danced wild across the forest floor. The rope man cursed, turning toward the blaze, eyes stinging from the smoke. That was all the opening Jonah needed. He closed the distance, wrenched the revolver from the man's hand, and slammed him into the dirt. Through the smoke, Evelyn's face appeared, eyes streaming, hair singed at the tips, but standing firm with a burning stick clutched in one hand like a weapon. They didn't speak, only ran, up the rocky trail toward the ravine. The fire roared behind them, devouring the night. By the time they reached the mouth of the old cave, their lungs burned raw, every breath scraping like sand. Jonah pulled her inside, pressing her down against the cool stone wall. She was coughing hard now, eyes squeezed shut. And then, through the rattle of her breath, she whispered, almost to herself, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned. The flames shall not set you ablaze." Jonah recognized it. Isaiah 43:2, spoken like a tether to something beyond the cave, beyond the smoke. When her eyes opened, they met his, steady despite the tears. "Would you have died for me?" she asked, her voice raw. Jonah didn't answer right away. He brushed a burnt lock of hair from her face, his thumb grazing her temple. "No," she whispered before he could speak. "I want to live for you." The cave went quiet except for their breathing. Outside, the forest burned, but here, in the stone's embrace, something else had caught flame, and this one neither of them intended to put out. The fire didn't chase them into the canyon, but its smell did, clinging to hair, clothes, and skin until every breath tasted like ash. By dawn, the sky above the ridge glowed the color of rust. The forest had stopped screaming, but it still smoldered. Jonah stepped outside the cave first, scanning the tree line. No movement, no hoofprints in the ash. He'd bought them time, but not safety. Evelyn emerged after him, her dress streaked with soot, eyes red but alert. She was holding something tight, like it might dissolve if she loosened her grip. It was the scorched scrap of leather Jonah had pried from the door weeks ago, the one branded with the words Apache Lover. He had kept it tucked under his coat, never thinking it more than a trophy of hate. But in the morning light, Evelyn's thumb traced the letters with care, pausing at the curling tail of the P. "This isn't random," she said, voice low. "It's handwriting." Jonah frowned. "Handwriting? On leather?" "I've seen it before," she murmured. "Clayton Reddick used to write letters to my father. Threats, promises, warnings, always in this same twisted cursive. He never signed them. He didn't need to." Jonah took the leather from her, holding it at an angle where the morning sun caught the ridges. The strokes were uneven, not from haste, but from force. It wasn't a stamp. It was a hand pressing heat into hide. "You're certain?" She nodded once, sharp. This was his mark, and if he left this here, he wants me to know it was him. The weight of that truth settled heavy between them. Jonah had lived years avoiding the kind of roads that led to men like Reddick. Now the path was as clear as the scars on her back. "We go to Dustwater," Jonah said finally. Evelyn looked at him in surprise. "The bounty's probably posted there. His men could be anywhere." "That's why we go. If he's left a trail this loud, it's because he thinks no one's going to follow it. We prove him wrong." She didn't answer, but the corner of her mouth twitched in something between fear and resolve. They started before midday, skirting the main trails, riding double on Jonah's old bay mare. By nightfall, the forest gave way to the dry flats north of town. That's where they found May Thompson's cabin, a one-room homestead with smoke curling gently from the chimney. May was older than the hills and just as stubborn. She looked Jonah up and down, then shifted her gaze to Evelyn without asking a single question.
She simply stepped aside and said, "Back room's warmer. There's stew if you've got the teeth for it." Inside, the heat from her wood stove seeped into their bones. May ladled stew into tin bowls, set bread on the table, and finally spoke. "Word is, Reddick's been riding high, boasting like a rooster with the sun at his back."
But men who crow too loud forget hawks are listening. Evelyn swallowed a spoonful of broth, then asked quietly, "Why help us?" "Because I've seen too many folks run out of places to stand, and because sometimes the only good thing left to do is keep someone else standing." When they left the next morning, May pressed a wool scarf into Evelyn's hands. "For the wind," she said, "and to remember that someone in these parts still wants you here." Evelyn wound it once around her neck, then tucked it into her coat. She didn't say thank you, not because she wasn't grateful, but because some gifts were better carried than spoken of. They rode on toward Dustwater, the branded leather wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of Jonah's saddlebag. It wasn't just proof now, it was an invitation. And Jonah Boone had decided he was going to RSVP in person. Dustwater looked the same as Jonah remembered. Dust choking the main street, hitching posts lined with tired horses, and faces that held more suspicion than welcome. But this time, he wasn't here to blend into the crowd. They came in at first light, hoods low, heading straight for the weathered white church on the hill. Reverend Elias Harper was already outside, sweeping the steps. He looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes when he saw Jonah. "Didn't think I'd see you back in this town," Elias said. Jonah dismounted slowly. "Didn't think I'd have reason to," he glanced at Evelyn. "We're looking for something you might have kept." The Reverend studied her face for a long moment before nodding toward the side door. "Come in, but quietly." Inside, the church smelled of old hymnals and beeswax. Elias led them down a narrow hallway to a locked door at the back. He fished a ring of keys from his pocket and turned one in the heavy iron lock. The hinges groaned open to reveal a small room lined with shelves. Dusty ledgers, donation receipts, and boxes marked with faded ink. "This is the archive," Elias said. "Anything tied to land deeds, tithes, or major correspondence from the last 30 years ends up here. What exactly are we looking for?" Evelyn stepped forward. "A letter. My father received one years ago from Clayton Reddick. He burned it, but I think he had to submit a copy here when he donated land to the church. Tax credit." Elias frowned. "You're saying this letter could—" "It names me," she said. "It calls for the death of a man I loved. It uses the same words branded on the leather he left at Jonah's door." The Reverend said nothing more, just turned to the shelves and began pulling boxes. Dust swirled in the narrow light from the single high window. After several tense minutes, he set a thin, cracked folder on the desk. Inside was the draft copy of the letter. The ink had bled slightly into the paper fibers, but the words were clear. "Your daughter has brought shame upon her blood. The half-breed she lies with will hang before the winter snows. You can buy distance with gold, but only fire washes sin clean." The signature line was blank, but Evelyn's hand trembled as she pointed to the curling P in upon, the same as on the branded leather. Jonah stared at it a long time before speaking. "It's enough." Elias's brow furrowed. "Enough for what?" "For the truth to see daylight," Jonah said. The Reverend shut the folder gently. "If you do this, it won't be just your names Reddick tries to ruin. He'll come for anyone who stands with you." Evelyn met his eyes. "Then let him come. I'm done hiding." That afternoon, they took the letter to the sheriff's office. The man behind the desk was barely 30, a new deputy with a wary look that softened when Jonah laid the oilcloth bundle on the table. Out came the branded leather, the letter, and an old war photograph Jonah had carried for years. The deputy studied each piece in silence. In the photograph, a tall figure stood before a burning Apache village, revolver at his side. The custom trigger guard and double-checked hammer were unmistakable. Only 6 were ever made for Wyoming militia captains. One belonged to Clayton Reddick. "I can call for a hearing," the deputy said finally. "Public. The mayor will have to listen. Folks might not like it, but they'll hear it." Jonah nodded. "Then set it. We'll be there." As they stepped out into the fading afternoon light, Evelyn adjusted May's wool scarf against the wind. "We're not just running anymore," she said quietly. "No," Jonah replied, eyes on the distant line of hills. "We're making them listen." The bell in the courthouse cupola tolled once, flat and dull against the midday heat. By the time the echo faded, the square was already full. Merchants leaning out from shaded doorways, ranch hands perched on hitch rails, women holding their children close. No one spoke above a murmur. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Jonah Boone stood near the center, hat brim low, one hand resting on the oilcloth bundle he'd carried from the mountains. Beside him, Evelyn kept her eyes on the groundboards, the wool scarf May had given her wound twice around her neck. The mayor, a stout man with the complexion of rawhide, cleared his throat. "You asked for a public hearing, Boone. Let's hear it. But keep it to the matter at hand." Jonah stepped forward and laid the bundle on the scarred table in front of the courthouse. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing the scorched scrap of leather and the brittle letter from Reverend Elias's archive. Sunlight caught the ragged edges, making them glow like embers. "This," Jonah said, lifting the leather so all could see, "was nailed above my door. The words burned into it matched the hand that wrote this letter. Same curl in the P, same slash on the T. Evelyn can tell you whose hand it is." Before she could speak, a voice cut across the square. "You think that proves anything?" Clayton Reddick strode from the shade of the mercantile porch, flanked by 2 broad-shouldered men. His coat was open, the heavy revolver at his hip gleaming in the light. He smiled without warmth. "That leather could have come from any hide in the territory. And as for that letter, folks know it's dangerous keeping company with savages. I've just said what most of you think." A ripple moved through the crowd, not quite agreement, not quite protest. Jonah kept his gaze steady. "You branded her name with fire. You called for death, not justice." Reddick spread his hands, mock innocent. "Some people don't belong here. I've always done my part to keep this town clean." The mayor shifted uneasily. The deputy, standing near the table, glanced toward the crowd as if measuring which way the wind might blow. Jonah raised the leather higher, turning it so the sun traced every line. "If you want the truth," he said, voice carrying to the far edges of the square, "look at what fire writes." The murmurs deepened, some faces hardening, others turning toward Reddick. The air felt tighter, the space between one heartbeat and the next stretching long. Somewhere in that silence, the point of no return had passed. A dry cough broke the silence. From the edge of the crowd, a thin man in a faded union coat leaned heavily on a hickory cane. His hair was the yellow-white of old bone, his face mapped with lines carved deep by wind and years. "Name's Dr. Aldous Merrick," he said, voice rough but carrion. "Some of you remember me. I set bones and stitched wounds from the Powder River down to the Salt Fork before most of you were shaven." Reddick's smile faltered for a breath. "Old man, you've no part in this." "I've every part," Merrick cut in. He stepped forward, the cane rapping the planks with a steady beat. "I was there the night Captain Clayton Reddick gave the order, no quarter. That means no prisoners, ladies and gentlemen. It means killing the wounded where they lay. We rode into an Apache camp before dawn.
We burned the lodges, shot the men, and drove the women and children into the creek bed. I worked till my hands cramped, and still the dyin' outnumbered the livin'. A murmur spread, thicker now, less uncertain.
Evelyn's breath caught, but she kept her chin high. Merrick's eyes shifted to Jonah. One of those wounded was this man's wife. Another was a child clinging to her skirts. Jonah didn't move, didn't blink. His voice was low. You did what you could that night. The old man nodded once. But Reddick, he walked through the ashes smiling. Same revolver on his hip today as he had then. A custom job, double-check hammer, carved trigger guard. 6 were made. I saw the number carved in his. The deputy stepped closer, glancing at the pistol under Reddick's coat. The crowd shifted again, a weight turning in their gaze. Reddick's voice rose, sharp with edge. You going to take the word of a whiskey-soaked relic over mine? This town exists because men like me kept the dirt from getting fouled. That dirt's fouled enough, someone in the crowd muttered. Another man spat into the dust. Jonah placed the photograph on the table beside the leather and the letter. It showed a tall figure before burning lodges, revolver in hand. Even in black and white, the carved guard was clear. Merrick's cane struck the boards one last time. You can ignore the leather, you can burn the letter, but you can't change what a man's done with his own hands. The square was quieter now, the kind of quiet that meant people were choosing sides, and some were stepping away from the one they'd stood on for too long. The boards of the courthouse steps creaked under Evelyn's weight as she moved past Jonah. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were on the crowd. Every step seemed to pull the square tighter, like a rope winding on itself. She stopped at the table. With slow hands, she unwound May's wool scarf. A faint wind lifted the ends as she let it fall around her shoulders. The scar across her collarbone caught the sunlight, the skin puckered and pale against the rest of her. No one spoke. Even the horses tied at the edge of the square seemed to stand still. This mark, she said, her voice steady though her fingers curled against the edge of the table, was burned into me by the same hand that wrote those words on that leather, the same hand that signed that letter, and the same hand that gripped the revolver Dr. Merrick remembers. She picked up the scorched leather, running her thumb over the uneven grooves. This wasn't meant to kill me. It was meant to tell everyone I wasn't worth keeping alive. Her gaze swept the faces before her, neighbors, strangers, the women who had crossed streets to avoid her. You've looked at me as if I were the shame, but shame has a face, and it's not mine. From the front row, Reverend Elias Harper shifted, leaning slightly toward the nearest knot of townsfolk. His voice was soft, but in the stillness it carried. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Romans 12:21. A woman in the crowd lowered her eyes. A rancher cleared his throat and looked away from Reddick. Evelyn set the leather down beside the photograph. If you still think I am the danger here, then look at this and decide whether you're protecting justice or just a man who tells you to fear what you don't understand. For a long moment, there was nothing but the whisper of the breeze through the awnings. Jonah watched the faces change, some slowly, some like a shutter swinging open. He could almost hear the collective weight of certainty shifting, the brittle snap of something long held breaking. Near the back, Tommy Greyhawk stepped forward just enough to be seen, his chin high. A child tugged at his sleeve and whispered his name aloud. In that fragile hush, the town stood on the knife edge between the past it had clung to and the truth it had just been handed. A scrape of boot leather on plank broke the stillness. One of Reddick's men, tall, jaw set, shifted his coat aside, letting the sun flash on the butt of his Colt. The other mirrored him, both stepping half a pace forward. Jonah's eyes caught the movement, his stance loosening the way a coiled rope unwinds. Ready, but not eager. Across the table, Reddick's smile returned, thin and sharp. Looks like folks here are about to remember who keeps this town standing. A murmur rose in the square, the kind that could tip either way. Then a crisp voice cut through it. "Holster your irons." The deputy had stepped forward, his hand resting light but deliberate on the grip of his own revolver. His gaze wasn't on Reddick's men, it was locked on Reddick himself. "By order of the sheriff's office, you and your men stand down." Reddick's jaw flexed. "You're making a mistake, boy." The deputy didn't flinch. "Mistake's letting it get this far." Somewhere in the crowd, someone called, "Let the law handle it." A second voice followed, sharper. "Ain't no law if it's just for some." The tide was shifting, faster now. Faces that had been hard with fear were hard with something else, resolve. Jonah didn't move, but he caught sight of Tommy Greyhawk again, now standing a few paces nearer. A ranch hand near him gave a small nod, as if acknowledging him for the first time. The boy's name rippled low through the crowd, not in whispers this time, but in plain speech. Reddick's fingers twitched near his belt. The deputy's voice hardened. "Clayton Reddick, you're under arrest for unlawful branding, conspiracy to commit murder, and the killing of non-combatants under military orders." Gasps rolled through the square. The list of charges was a rope drawn tight. For a heartbeat, it seemed Reddick might gamble on drawing first. Then his men hesitated, just long enough for the deputy to signal two townsmen who'd been waiting at the edge. They stepped in quick, rifles leveled, and the balance tipped. "You'll regret this," Reddick spat, but his voice didn't carry like before. The deputy stepped closer, holding out the shackles. "I imagine I'll sleep just fine." Jonah finally exhaled, but his hand stayed near his side. Dust swirled low along the boards, curling between boots, as if marking the line that had just been crossed. The iron cuffs clicked shut around Reddick's wrists, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the dry air. For all his swagger, he didn't fight once they were on, only kept his shoulders squared, his chin lifted, as if pride alone could make the steel vanish. The deputy took his pistol, turning it so the sun caught the carved trigger guard before sliding it into his own belt. Murmurs rippled through the square at the sight of the unmistakable mark, proof no one could talk away now. "Clear a path," the deputy ordered. The crowd shifted reluctantly, boots scuffing the dirt. Reddick's men trailed behind, their weapons taken, eyes darting at every face that now stared back without fear. Jonah watched as they led Reddick toward the jailhouse. His steps were still steady, but there was no triumph in them. Only the slow bleed of a man realizing the world would remember him not as a defender of the town, but as the one who'd stained it. Beside Jonah, Evelyn's gaze stayed fixed on the line of prisoners. "They'll hang him." "Likely," Jonah said. "You're not staying?" He shook his head. "Not here for a rope. We came for truth, not the show after." The mayor glanced their way, perhaps expecting them to follow the crowd toward the gallows. But Jonah turned, guiding Evelyn down a side street where the boards gave way to hard-packed earth. The sound of voices behind them began to fade. They passed May Thompson's old friend, the woman pausing in her doorway to watch them go. She didn't speak, just touched two fingers to her brow in a silent salute. Evelyn returned a faint nod. At the end of the street, they paused to let a wagon pass. The sky above was beginning to pale toward evening, clouds thin and high, the air cooling just enough to carry the scent of mesquite. Jonah glanced back once, just enough to see the crowd swell behind the jail. Then he looked ahead again. "Justice doesn't need us watching it work," he said. Evelyn didn't answer, but the set of her shoulders shifted, less weight pressing down, more space to breathe. They kept walking, leaving the square to its own reckoning.
Behind them, Dustwater would talk of this day for years, but Jonah Boone and Evelyn Hart would not be there to hear it. The first light came slow over Dustwater, touching the rooftops with a pale gold that didn't quite reach the ground. The streets were empty now, last night's heat still caught in the dust and timber. Somewhere behind them, the town was waking to its first day without Clayton Reddick walking free. Jonah tightened the cinch on his mare, the leather creaking in the cool air. Evelyn stood a few feet away, May's scarf wound once around her neck, her hands tucked into the folds of her coat. She watched the eastern horizon as if it might speak. Neither had said much since they'd left the square. The silence wasn't heavy, it was something else, like the space between waves when the sea is holding its breath. "You ready?" Jonah asked finally. Evelyn nodded, swinging into her saddle with a practiced motion. "I don't think I'll ever be ready," she said quietly, "but I'm not afraid to ride out anymore." They set off at a walk, the horses' hooves pressing a steady rhythm into the red dirt road. The sun climbed higher, catching the thin dust clouds that rose in their wake.
Behind them, Dustwater grew small, its outlines blurring into the dry hills. Jonah glanced back only once. "You think they'll change?" "Some will," Evelyn said. "Some never will. But the truth's out. That's more than they had yesterday." They rode on in silence for a while, the land stretching wide and open. Sagebrush caught the light, and somewhere far off, a hawk's cry cut through the stillness. At a bend where the road dipped toward a narrow creek, Jonah slowed. "There's no going back to what we were before this," he said, his voice low, almost more to himself than to her. Evelyn met his eyes. "I don't want to." He gave a short nod, and something unspoken settled between them. Not a promise made aloud, but a vow carried in the way they kept riding, side by side, toward whatever waited beyond the ridge. The morning wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine from the high country. Evelyn drew in a breath, letting it fill her chest. The road ahead bent out of sight, but it didn't matter. They would follow it until it ended, or until they chose a different one. Behind them, the town would go on, its stories reshaped. Ahead, the land waited, open and unclaimed. And somewhere in that space between past and horizon, Jonah Boone and Evelyn Hart found enough to keep riding. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The climb back into the high country took the better part of a day, the pack horses leaning into the grade, their breath steaming in the early cold. The scent of pine thickened with every mile, until it felt as though the air itself had been drawn fresh from the heartwood. When they reached the old cabin, the shutters hung crooked, and the hearth lay cold, a scatter of gray ash the only memory of its last fire. Jonah set to work before the sun dropped, pulling down the warped boards, letting the stale dust drift out into the light. Evelyn moved quietly through the rooms, shaking out the musty blankets, opening the windows to let in the sharp wind. By nightfall, the place smelled less like neglect and more like wood smoke waiting to happen. The next morning, they started on the well. Jonah dug while Evelyn worked the pulley, the hollow ring of the spade on stone marking slow progress. By the third day, the water came, a rush of cold so clear it carried a faint taste of iron. Jonah took the first swallow, then handed the bucket to Evelyn. She drank and smiled. "Enough for more than 2, she said, and he knew she wasn't just talking about water. When the well was lined and capped, they planted. Rows of beans first, then squash in the wider mounds, each seed pressed into the dark soil like a quiet promise. Evelyn's hands were streaked with dirt, her hair pulled back, and there was a calm in her face Jonah hadn't seen before. "If we plant now, we'll have a harvest before the frost," she said, half to herself, half to him. Last came the door. Jonah had found a tin of paint at the bottom of an old trunk, color labeled ash blossom, a pale blue-gray that shifted in the light. Together, they brushed it on to the new boards until the whole doorway glowed soft against the pine walls. "Peace," Evelyn murmured, running her fingertips over the grain. "Even if it's just a door."
Jonah thought it was more than that. It was an invitation. Word must have traveled faster than they expected.
Within a week, the first visitor came, a lanky young man whose own family had cast him out for marrying a Cheyenne girl. He asked for a place to sleep through the winter and offered to work the fences in return. Evelyn nodded once and showed him where the spare blankets were kept. A few days later, a woman arrived leading a sway-backed mare. A long scar curved down one side of her face, and she carried herself like someone who had learned not to ask permission. She offered to trade her cooking for a roof. Jonah repaired the mare's bad leg while Evelyn cleaned the woman's hands with warm water and soap. Not long after, the horse stayed too. Jonah rigged a splint, and the animal limped more easily with each passing day. Evelyn brushed it every morning, her voice low as she spoke to it, though Jonah could never quite catch the words. Whit Carter rode up one afternoon, bringing coffee beans wrapped in a sheet of newspaper. He stayed long enough to drink 2 cups, telling them the old names for the ridges and gullies, the ones no map showed anymore. May sent a pair of wool gloves and a folded blanket with a note, for the ones who keep the fire low but steady. And Tommy, quiet, watchful Tommy, came to stay on weekends. Jonah taught him how to split rails without splintering them. Evelyn showed him how to set a fence so it wouldn't rub the hide off a horse. Tommy didn't say much, but he didn't need to. His hands learned the work, and his eyes softened when he was here. By late autumn, the cabin no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like something else entirely. Solid walls against the wind, a blue-gray door that didn't just keep trouble out, but welcomed the right kind of trouble in. That night, after everyone had gone to their beds, Jonah banked the fire. It no longer roared the way it had in the first days. Now it burned low, steady, as if it had learned the length of their nights and kept to it. By the time winter settled over Dustwater, the town was quieter. The loudest voices had found less to shout about. The black paint that once screamed on barn doors had been scrubbed away. The hitch posts no longer bore slurs burned into the wood. Reddick sat in a holding cell in the territorial capital, awaiting trial. It would be the court's work to decide his fate now, not the rope and the mob. Tommy's name, once spat like a curse, was spoken plain in the schoolyard. The children who had once turned away now called to him, asking if he'd be back next Sunday to teach them how to braid rawhide. One gray morning, Miss Lorna, Dustwater's schoolteacher, unlocked the classroom and found a book lying on her desk. A worn King James Bible, its leather corners softened with use. Tucked inside, between Corinthians and Galatians, was an unsealed envelope. She hesitated only a moment before opening it. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, each letter pressed into the page as though it mattered. I have learned that love is not the thunderclap the poets promised me. It is the soil beneath the snow, holding its warmth when the air is bitter. Jonah showed me this, not with grand rescues or fierce words, but with the simple act of staying. There was a time I thought survival meant running until nothing could follow. But the fire taught me courage, and the man who stayed taught me that courage without rest is only another kind of fear. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. I cannot name the day I began to love him. It came quietly, like water rising in a well, until I looked around and found the thirst had gone. He is not my captor. He is not my savior. He is the one who stayed. Lorna read the letter twice before slipping it back into the Bible. She didn't tell the children whose hand had written it. Some things were better left to be found, piece by piece, in their own time. That Sunday, Reverend Elias read no special sermon. Instead, he closed the hindle and looked out at the pews. His eyes found Jonah and Evelyn in the back row, and for a moment it seemed as if the whole church breathed in together. No one clapped, no one shouted. The silence was warmer than either. Spring came late in the high country. Snowmelt carved silver lines down the mountain, feeding the beans and squash in their rows.
Wild lupine and bluebells crowded the slope, their colors spilling like ink in the wind. The cabin door still shone its pale ash-blossom hue. Inside, the hearth never went cold. Travelers stopped for a night, sometimes for longer. The young couple from the valley, the woman with the scar, Tommy when the roads were clear, each left behind something more than they had brought.
Jonah and Evelyn never held a wedding. They didn't need one. Their vows had been made in the long hours of work, in the quiet sharing of bread, in the way they kept the fire low so it would last the night. One evening, as the wind threaded through the pines, Evelyn stepped outside with a lantern. She set it on the porch rail where the light could be seen from the trail. Jonah joined her, leaning on the post. They didn't speak. The lamp's flame trembled once, then steadied. Out here, tomorrow wasn't a promise. It was the practice of staying. And maybe, in their quiet porch light, we catch a reflection of our own long roads, the places we've chosen to stay, the people worth staying for. If stories like this still speak to your heart, ride with us again for more true Wild West stories, where grit meets grace.